Okay, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I was born not too far from where this apartment is. Both my parents came over after the war. They were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. They met and married in a DP, displaced people's camp in Austria. And they came over in the late 1940s. They were pretty modest working people. My father was a factory worker. Eventually he moved up to be a foreman. My mother raised the three children, and then when we got to late grade school, she began to work as a bookkeeper. She had a very good education before the war. She was studying mathematics at Warsaw University when the war broke out. And my parents were, I'd say I came from a political home. We read the newspapers, they didn't have many talking heads shows back then, but I remember we watched Meet the Press. But most importantly, politics was always dinner table conversation. Most vividly, of course, during my years growing up was the war in Vietnam, also the civil rights movement. And they had their opinions about Israel and Palestine, though I don't think we talked about it as Palestine back then. It was more Israel and the Arabs. And they were plainly sympathetic to the injustices that were being inflicted on the Palestinians. I had vague knowledge of the topic, sort of like what every good leftist should know about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I pretty much knew up until the early 1980s. During the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in June 1982, I began to get publicly involved in the conflict. And I was at that point what's called, I think ABD is the term, all but dissertation. I had finished all my graduate coursework, but couldn't come up with a dissertation topic. And in the course of the Israel invasion of Lebanon, I joined a group. It was called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. We weren't referring then to Sabra and Shatila, we were referring just to the general carnage of the Israeli invasion. And one of the topics that sort of divided the group was taking a position on what was called Zionism. I didn't really know much about Zionism, and I don't believe in taking positions in anything unless you really understand what you're talking about. I'm not too much into sloganeering. And so I sat down and started to read in the topic. And I read so much at some point I said, well, why not just turn this into a doctoral dissertation? So I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the theory of Zionism. So at this point I had an intellectual connection with the topic. I had a political connection with the topic since I was involved publicly on the Israeli invasion. And given that I'm Jewish in my family background, and we're talking about what claims to be a Jewish state, or a state which speaks in the name of the Jewish people, I had a personal connection with it. Since there was like a confluence of the personal, the political, and the intellectual, it was almost inevitable that it would come to preoccupy a large part of my life.
Okay, good. Why don't you tell us, say, briefly about each of your books, and especially the one you're planning to work on.
In 1995, I wrote Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, which is basically a collection of essays I had written over a fairly long period. The first in 1984 on a book called From Time Immemorial by somebody named Joan Peters. It's unclear whether she actually wrote the book. Not so important. And that book purported that Palestine was empty before the Jews came. The Jews came, made the desert bloom, and then all these Arabs from neighboring states surreptitiously entered Palestine to take advantage of the new economic opportunities and then pretended to be Palestinians. So the core of the book is there is no real Palestinian question because the Palestinians are all a fake. And the book received accolades across the spectrum of American arts and letters. Saul Bellow, the Nobel laureate, Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate, Barbara Tuchman and Lucy Dawidowich, the historians. There was quite a impressive array of characters endorsing the book. And for reasons not worth going into now, I did a fairly detailed analysis of the book to demonstrate that the whole book was a fraud. It was a complete hoax. And I made my little name from exposing the Joan Peters hoax actually just about 20 years ago, this past month. And I wrote subsequent investigations of various mainstream claims about the Israel-Palestine conflict, about the June 1967 war, the October 1973 war, about the origins of the refugees, and so forth. Basically, you can call it forensic scholarship. I looked at the claims that were made, I looked at the supporting data, and I reached conclusions about whether or not this scholarship, more often not, whether or not this scholarship was giving you an accurate picture of what actually happened. Then after that, I wrote a book entitled The Rise and Fall of Palestine, a personal account of the Intifada years. And basically, I went back every summer during the first Intifada from 1988 to 95 and stayed with a couple of families. One, a Christian Palestinian family from a little village outside Bethlehem called Beit Sahor, and then a Palestinian Muslim refugee family from Fawar camp outside Hebron. I would shuttle between these two families, both of whom I became personally connected with, and I wrote basically an account of the first Intifada as seen through their eyes. After that, I wrote a couple of books on the Nazi Holocaust, one in which I examined the claims of Daniel Goldhagen in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Basically, his thesis was, since the beginning of time, all the Germans wanted to murder the Jews. Along came Hitler, he gave them the green light, and finally they got to do what they wanted to do for millennia. Kind of a lunatic book. Of course, it's lunatic theses like that get raves in the United States. So it was a big national bestseller. And basically I said the whole book was nonsense. After that, I wrote a book entitled The Holocaust Industry, which looked at the way the Holocaust is exploited for political and financial gain by American Jewish elites. And right now I'm working on a book on what's called the new anti-Semitism, which I basically claim is an orchestrated extravaganza having very little to do with reality. And the second half of the book deals with the politics of Alan Dershowitz of Harvard.
Can you outline any problems you've had in being able to work publish, get your voice across in various media due to the somewhat controversial topics and opinions that you've had?
Well, as a matter of principle and honor, I never complain in public. I save complaints for my friends who have to bear with them on a daily, sometimes an hourly basis. But I don't think it's...
Just go ahead. Okay, I won't ask you about any specifics, but...
No, I'll answer your question. We're resuming?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's proper to complain about one's life in public, but I can give you a kind of political answer. Let's take the case of the Holocaust industry. The Holocaust industry sold worldwide, now I would estimate about 250,000 copies, perhaps even more. It was an international bestseller. It's been translated now into 20 different languages, a pretty hefty sum. It was on the bestseller list, the top 10 bestseller lists in countries as diverse as Brazil and Italy. It was on the Der Spiegel bestseller list, that's the major one in Europe, for 7 months, number 1 or number 2. Well, what happened to the book in the United States? In the United States, I was not on one television program, no interview, apart from the alternative radio program, Democracy Now! I was not on one radio program, not one interview. Not one not one television interview, not one radio interview. Absolute, across the board, silence. The New York Times ran a full-page review in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, which consisted of a barrage of ad hominem attacks on me. And basically, it did its job. You have to understand that the New York Times book review serves basically 2 functions. Number 1, it's the review that librarians look at across the country to decide what books to order for their collections. So one New York Times book review calling the author an anti-Semite and this and that means you've just killed all library orders. The second function of the New York Times book review is it tells second and third tier papers which books to review. So it won't determine what the Washington Post reviews. It won't determine what the LA Times reviews. It won't determine what the Boston Globe reviews. But the second and third tier, even things like Chicago Tribune, which is large, it will tell all those papers which books to review, which books are not important, and which books are taboo. Mine was a taboo. So apart from, I would say, major reviews in the Times and the Washington Post and so forth, those reviews sent out the signal, this is anti-Jewish, don't review it. And there were no reviews, nothing.
What did the Post say about the same?
It was a guy from, I think, Stanford. They all said the same thing. The guy's a nut, obviously anti-Semite, even if he's Jewish. Everything he says is lunatic. Let's move on. Things along those lines. So that's how you kill books in the United States.
Have you been abroad to
well, look, I was in the UK. My book was excerpted in The Guardian, two huge excerpts from The Guardian. It was reviewed in every paper in England. I was in at least at least 10 BBC programs. I was on all the television programs, all the major television programs. It was a huge event. It was a huge event. In Germany, there's just no words to describe. It was also a huge event in Germany. As it was in Italy, I never went to Brazil. I didn't have the time. Brazil, just the United States. Very efficient means of controlling what you can and can't hear.
Do you want to speak about having to leave teaching in New York to go to Chicago? Okay. How about, do you have any way of knowing how far you are up on the enemies list, the various Jewish enemies list? Do you ever get any feedback from somebody that
no,
you're number 1 or you're number 5?
I have no insights into the machinations of the mainstream Jewish organizations. I don't know much about them. I just know them from what they write, and that's quite sufficient for me. You can't really, I don't know how much is coordinated, how much is orchestrated, how much it's the independent initiative of a thug here and a hoodlum there.
Yeah. Can you relate any of the personal encounters and activities that you had with these two families when you were in Palestine? Any specific memorable incidents or relationships, close relationships that you made?
I became quite close to both families. The family in Beit Sahur, called the Barhan family, and the family in Hebron is the Musa Abu Heshhesh. That's him over here. That's Musa, and that's Nidal and Musa together. I became quite close to them. The only way I can convey to a audience that doesn't know me and can't possibly get to know me from a brief comment in the video, the depth of my feeling for them is I recall quite vividly that when my parents passed away within a few months of each other, my father first and my mother second, and I do vividly recall that when they passed away, of course one of the questions is, who do you tell? And among the 4 or 5 people I immediately wanted to inform were my friends Musa and Nidal, to tell them my parents had died.
Do you still communicate with them?
Yeah, Nidal, one of her daughters is getting married in August. And of course I was invited to the wedding, but I won't be able to make it. And, which reminds me, I have to send a little gift. I forgot that. And Musa, I talk to once every 2 weeks, but his phone is so much out of order. It's hard to keep up with him.
Which village is he in?
He's from Fawar Camp in outside Hebron.
Hebron's the city that has a Jewish settlement downtown.
Between 200 and 400 Jewish lunatics, mostly from where I live now in Brooklyn. Meshuggah Jews who decide they're going to recreate the Alamo in Hebron.
Are you familiar with the various, let's say, the characteristics or the personalities of various settlements? Do you know about them?
No, I only passed through a couple of settlements because it was a shorter route to where I had to go I forgot which settlement I passed through. I think it was Kiryat Arba, because I was going to Hebron. But apart from that, I never go to the settlements.
Now, you ask for papers and so forth by the security?
I have no problem. I've not had problems going in and out. You know, that's very, it's very, serendipitous. I can have wonderful luck, and then once they'll turn me around. It's hard to predict.
So, how kind of, what is their reception for, say, an American Jew kind of poking their nose around? Did they go home?
It all depends on how tense the moment is when you're there, and a lot of it, I think, is local decisions. I don't think a lot of it is decided in an office.
Local commander.
Yeah.
How he feels.
Or even a local soldier, just his mood.
Have you any feeling for, let's say, in the Army in general, the gradation of hatred or despising of the Arabs?
I don't know anything about the Army. I mean, look, the whole environment is very corrupting, and it's easy to get intoxicated on power there. You're an 18-year-old kid, your hormones are raging, you get to lord it over everyone around you. You decide their fate. You can make people stand at a roadblock for 4 hours or 5 hours. You can humiliate and degrade people as you choose. You can make them take off their clothes. You can make them crawl on the floor. You can make them bark like a dog. You can do whatever you want. And, most people, that's human nature. That kind of power corrupts most people. And then you had two added layers, just the sheer inequity in the distribution of power, the sheer lawlessness, and then on top of that you have a deeply embedded racism, which is going to be very corrupting too when the disproportionate power is so huge. And then on top of that, you have the anger at the suicide bombings. So when you compound all of that, you get a very lethal brew, and people there are very nasty.
Do you have any sense of how Israeli public opinion has drifted one way or the other, or say what percentage of the population would like to settle, in a fair way?
The polls now show a reasonably equitable settlement. Reasonably equitable doesn't solve all the problems, but it's getting there. Would get the support of about 1/3 of the Israeli population, about 32% will support what's called the Geneva Accords, which isn't an answer, but certainly gets close to it. Those findings, they co-inhabit the same political territory as about 60% would like to expel all the Arabs, including the Arabs from Israel. And you find the same sort of apparent, though it's not real, apparent contradiction among Palestinians, about 80% of whom support the terror attacks, but probably nearly that number would also support a two-state settlement. So you have, there's no contradiction between the two. The Israelis will accept, about 1/3 will accept the Palestinian state, but would be just as happy to get rid of all the Arabs. And at this point, about 80% of Palestinians think that the only way to get their state is through terror tactics. So there's no contradiction, I don't think.
I'm not, maybe run out of general questions. Is there anything that came to
No,
mind while we...
no, that's fine.
what I'd like to do is, if you would, if you could, I'll get the camera closer and you can maybe describe your friends.
Okay.
Just carry this.
This is my closest Palestinian friend, and I consider him a close friend, period, no qualifications. Musa Abu Heshhesh. This is when I first met him in 1988 in Palestine with his little son, Urwa. Urwa is actually now just going to be entering college. He took what's called a Tawjihi, which is the national exam when you were a senior in high school. He just took it. So here he's 2, and now he should be about 17. So let's see, 88 to 2004. Yeah. So it's 16 years. So he's about 2 here. So he's about 17 or 18 now. And then this is the picture of Musa in 1995. As you could see, he aged a lot during the Intifada years. It was a very hard time for him, as for all Palestinians. And this is him about 3 years ago. He now works for the Israeli Human Rights Center, B'Tselem. He's a field worker. This is Musa in 1995 with Nidal, the woman from Beit Sahur, whose daughter is getting married next week to, I think, a Palestinian in Italy. And that's basically it.
Okay. Thank you very much for
Sure.
your time.
My pleasure.